Why was one structure still breathing warmth, while every timber cabin in the valley had gone cold? That was the question a supply rider named Orville Cass asked himself on the morning of January 14th, 1887, as he pushed his horse through a foot of crusted snow along the Sweetwater Flats Depot line in southern Wyoming territory. The temperature had not climbed above 4 degrees Fahrenheit minus 16 degrees Celsius in 4 days. 3 families on the eastern stretch of the rail corridor had already burned through their entire winter with stock. 2 section hands had frostbitten fingers from sleeping in poorly insulated bunkhouses where the stove heat bled through the walls before dawn. But there, standing alone at the edge of the old maintenance yard, was a structure that should not have been warm at all. It was a decommissioned railroad water tank, a cylindrical iron shell, roughly 12 feet, 3.6 meters, in diameter and 14 feet, 4.3 meters tall, bolted to a low stone foundation that had been poured sometime in the mid-1870s. By every standard of frontier logic, it should have been the coldest object on the property. Iron conducts heat away from the body on contact. A cylinder has no corners, no dead air pockets, no insulating geometry. It looked, to every experienced eye in the valley, like a giant metal bucket waiting to freeze whoever was foolish enough to sleep inside it. And yet a thin column of smoke rose steadily from a flue pipe that had been fitted to the top cap, and when Orville swung down from his horse and pressed his palm against the outer shell, expecting cold steel, he felt something that stopped him cold in a different way entirely. It was warm, not scorching, not dangerously hot, but warm in the way a well-built stone hearth is warm 3 hours after the last log is burned, a deep, radiating warmth that seemed to come from within the iron itself, as if the metal had swallowed the heat and refused to let it go. Inside that tank lived a railroad maintenance hand by the name of Silas Brennan. He had converted it the previous autumn, alone, using scavenged materials, a second-hand stove, and an understanding of heat that nobody in the valley had thought to ask him about. They had laughed at him when he started. They were not laughing now. This is the story of what Silas Brennan understood about heat geometry and thermal mass, and why it took a killing winter to prove him right. If you find yourself drawn to the forgotten engineering of the American frontier, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment below telling us where in the world you're watching from. There are more stories like this one, and we're just getting started. To understand what Silas Brennan did, you have to first understand where he was doing it, and how brutal that place could be. The Sweetwater Flats corridor of southern Wyoming territory sat at roughly 6,200 feet, 1,890 meters, above sea level, with a Union Pacific rail line cut east to west through a landscape that offered almost nothing in the way of shelter. The terrain was open short-grass prairie interrupted by shallow draws and occasional outcroppings of sandstone, beautiful in summer, merciless in winter. There were no large forests. The nearest stand of usable timber was better than 35 miles, 56 kilometers, to the northwest, accessible only by wagon when the ground was dry and not at all when it wasn't. This was not a detail. It was a central fact of survival, what was the primary fuel of frontier heating in the 1880s. A standard single-room timber cabin of the era, roughly 14 by 16 feet, 4.3 by 4.9 m, with a stone or clay chink fireplace, could burn through 4 to 6 cords of wood in a Wyoming winter, depending on the severity of the season and the quality of the construction. 1 cord of split hardwood weighed approximately 2,000 to 3,000 pounds, 900 to 1,360 kilograms, and took up a stack 4 feet wide by 4 feet tall by 8 feet long, 1.2 by 1.2 by 2.4 m. Getting that wood to the Sweetwater Flats meant either hauling it overland at significant expense or relying on the railroad's periodic supply drops, which were inconsistent, delayed by weather, and subject to priorities of the line's commercial cargo. The winters themselves were not merely cold. They were systematically destructive. The Northern Plains blizzard cycle of the late 1880s, which would culminate in the catastrophic winter of 1886 to 87 across Montana, Wyoming, and the Dakotas, brought sustained temperatures between minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit and minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 29 degrees Celsius to minus 40 degrees Celsius, combined with winds exceeding 40 miles per hour, 64 kilometers per hour. Wind chill values in open terrain regularly reached equivalent temperatures below minus 60 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 51 degrees Celsius. These were not conditions that a poorly sealed timber cabin could reliably survive, and most of the cabins along the rail corridor were, by any engineering standard, poorly sealed. Local oral accounts from depot settlements along the line describe a consistent pattern: walls framed in rough-cut pine with minimal chinking, single-pane glass windows that frosted over on the interior, fireplaces positioned on exterior walls, a design that radiated a significant portion of the generated heat directly into the outside air rather than into the room. In a typical night at minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 29 degrees Celsius, a section hand living in such a cabin might wake every 2 to 3 hours to reload the stove, burning through a quarter-core wood in a single overnight cycle just to maintain a survivable interior temperature of 45 degrees Fahrenheit to 50 degrees Fahrenheit, 7 degrees Celsius to 10 degrees Celsius. This was the baseline. This was what normal looked like. It was into this context, scarce timber, brutal cold, chronically inefficient shelter, that a 38-year-old railroad maintenance hand named Silas Brennan arrived at the Sweetwater Flats Depot in the spring of 1886, having been transferred from a section post near Laramie. He came with a bedroll, a small tool chest, and a set of habits formed during a childhood in the coal fields of eastern Pennsylvania, where the men who survived cold winters were not always the ones with the most fuel, but the ones who understood where heat went when it left a fire. He looked at the decommissioned water tank in the maintenance yard and saw something that nobody else had thought to see. He saw a shell designed to hold liquid without losing it to the environment, and he began to wonder what would happen if, instead of water, you asked it to hold heat. Before Silas acted on his idea, he spent the better part of his first summer at Sweetwater Flats doing what he always did, watching. He watched how the section hands built their morning fires, big, fast blazes that threw a rush of heat into a room and then died down rapidly, leaving the cabin cold again within the hour. He watched how the depot foreman's quarters, the largest and best-built structure on the property at roughly 20 by 24 feet, 6.1 by 7.3 m, with a full stone chimney and a proper iron range, still required nearly constant tending to the night to hold a temperature above 55 degrees Fahrenheit, 13 degrees Celsius, when the wind came from the northwest. He watched how the bunkhouse, a long, low structure housing 6 to 8 men, became a competition between the men closest to the stove who sweated and the men at the far ends who froze, because radiant heat from an open firebox does not travel well across 30 feet 9 meters of open air. He also watched the wood supply. By late October, before the first serious cold had even arrived, 3 of the 5 family cabins on the eastern stretch of the corridor had already consumed more than half of their estimated winter wood stock. The math was not complicated, and it was not encouraging. If November through February brought temperatures consistent with the previous 2 winters, sustained lows of minus 15 degrees Fahrenheit to minus 25 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 26 degrees Celsius to minus 32 degrees Celsius, those families would run short of fuel somewhere between late January and mid-February. They would either burn furniture, burn structural timbers, or send someone on a dangerous overland trip for resupply. This was not an unusual situation. It was the ordinary condition of winter life on the open high plains. What made Silas different was not that he saw the problem. Everyone saw the problem. What made him different was that he traced it back to its root cause with unusual precision. After several evenings of quiet observation, he came to a conclusion that he shared with no one at the time, but recorded later in a short written account that a depot clerk apparently preserved among station papers. The heat is not scarce. The buildings are leaking it as fast as it is made. Fix the leak, and the wood takes care of itself. The leak he was describing was not a gap in the floorboards or a cracked window pane, though those were real enough. He was describing something more fundamental: the geometry and material composition of the cabins themselves. A standard square or rectangular timber cabin of the era presented 4 flat exterior wall surfaces to the outside air. Each flat wall acted as a broad radiating panel. It shed heat across its entire surface area simultaneously. A 14 by 16 foot cabin had roughly 480 square feet, 44.6 square meters, of exterior wall surface, not counting the roof, through which heat bled continuously into the outside atmosphere. The logs themselves, even well chinked, had a thermal resistance that barely slowed the transfer. A wall 8 inches 20 centimeters of solid pine thick has an R value of approximately R8 to R10 by modern measurement, meaning that on a night of minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 29 degrees Celsius outside, and 55 degrees Fahrenheit, 13 degrees Celsius inside, heat was crossing that wall at a rate that the stove could barely replace. Silas did not have the vocabulary of R values, but he understood the principle. He had grown up watching his father pack coal ash insulation into the spaces between the walls of their Pennsylvania row house, a trick the older miners used to slow the heat loss. And he had spent enough winters in enough poorly built rail structures to develop an intuitive sense of where warmth went to die. He looked at the decommissioned water tank and saw a different geometry entirely. A cylinder. A cylinder presents a curved surface to the outside air. Its surface-to-volume ratio, the amount of exterior skin relative to the interior space it encloses, is mathematically smaller than that of a rectangular structure of equivalent floor area. In practical terms, for roughly the same interior living space, a cylindrical structure exposes less wall surface to the cold outside air. Less surface area means less total heat loss. Less heat loss means less would burn to maintain a livable temperature. He had not read this in a book. He had worked out by looking at what was in front of him, a structure that had been engineered to hold liquid efficiently, and that might, with the right modifications, hold heat by the same logic. The water tank sat empty. The maintenance yard had no other use for it. The depot superintendent had already discussed scrapping it for iron. Silas Brennan asked permission to live in it instead. The depot superintendent at Sweetwater Flats was a practical Wyoming man named Gideon Martz, 45 years old, originally from Ohio, and firmly of the opinion that the railroad's maintenance hands should concern themselves with rail beds and water lines rather than experimental architecture. When Silas Brennan came to him in late August of 1886 with a request to convert the old water tank into a winter dwelling, Gideon's first response was a long, flat silence followed by a single question. "You want to sleep inside a tin can?" It was not a question that expected a complicated answer, but Silas gave one anyway. He explained the surface area logic, though he described it in the plain language of a working man rather than the language of physics. Less wall facing the wind, less heat bleeding away, less would burn overnight. He explained that the tank's iron shell, if properly lined with a layer of insulating material, would absorb radiant heat from a central stove during the burning hours and release it slowly after the fire died down. The same principle, he noted, that made a cast iron skillet stay hot on a cold counter long after the flame was off. He explained that the cylindrical shape meant there were no corners, no dead zones where cold air pooled and stratified near the floor, while hot air was trapped uselessly at the ceiling peak. Gideon Martz listened to all of this with the expression of a man who has heard a lot of ideas and seen most of them fail. Then he told Silas that the tank was railroad property and would remain railroad property, that any modification would need to be reversible without cost to the company, and that if Silas froze to death in there, the paperwork involved would be considerable. He also told him he could have it. What Silas did over the next 6 weeks, working evenings and weekends, using materials he scavenged, purchased cheaply, or fabricated himself, represented a careful, methodical application of principles that frontier builders had arrived at through hard experience, but rarely assembled in a single structure. The tank itself was a riveted iron shell approximately 3/16 of an inch, 4.8 millimeters thick, supported on a circular sandstone foundation roughly 18 inches, 45 centimeters, high that had been poured to hold the tank's weight when full of water, which, when operational, would have been approximately 14,000 pounds, 6,350 kilograms. The foundation was solid. Silas recognized immediately that the stonework was his greatest asset, because stone, unlike iron, holds heat exceptionally well. Sandstone has a volumetric heat capacity of roughly 40 to 50 BTU per cubic foot per degree Fahrenheit, meaning a given mass of it absorbs and stores significantly more thermal energy than the same mass of wood or plaster. The 18-inch stone ring at the base of the tank was essentially a built-in thermal battery, and had been sitting there for years waiting to be used as one. His first modification was to the interior wall. Working from a supply of burlap sacking, ash from the depot's burn pile, and strips of scrap felt salvaged from worn-out rail packing material, he constructed a liner that he pressed against the inner face of the iron shell in a continuous layer approximately 3 to 4 inches, 7.5 to 10 centimeters thick. The material was not elegant. It was not even particularly effective by modern insulation standards. But it served a critical purpose. It created a thermal break between the living space and the iron skin, preventing the metal from acting as a direct cold conductor against the interior air. Without it, the iron shell would behave like a radiator in reverse, drawing warmth from inside the cabin and transferring to the frozen air outside. He cut a door opening on the south-facing side of the tank, south, because that face received the most solar gain during the short winter days, and because it placed the wind-exposed north face at the back of the structure away from the entry gap. The door itself was framed in salvaged rail tie lumber, hung on heavy iron hinges, and fitted with a double layer of heavy canvas on the interior face to serve as a draft seal. For the stove, he positioned a small cast-iron box stove, a second-hand unit he had purchased from a departing section hand for $3, near the center of the floor rather than against the wall. This was by itself an unusual choice. Standard frontier cabin design placed a stove or fireplace against an exterior wall or in a corner, which allowed for simpler flue routing, but wasted a significant portion of the radiant heat to the outside. A centrally placed stove radiates in all directions simultaneously. In a cylindrical space with curved walls, the heat emitted from a central source reflects off those curved walls and returns toward the center of the room, a geometry that naturally concentrates warmth at occupant level, rather than allowing it to stratify toward the ceiling in the flat wall and corner pattern of a rectangular cabin. The flue pipe he ran vertically through the top of the tank, fitted through a sealed iron collar to prevent rain and snow intrusion. The vertical run was intentional. A longer vertical flue creates a stronger natural draft, pulling combustion gases efficiently upward and preventing backdraft that could fill the living space with smoke. By mid-September, the conversion was structurally complete. The interior floor space was approximately 110 square feet, 10.2 square meters. Modest, but sufficient for a single man's winter quarters, a stove, a sleeping platform, and a small workbench. And then Silas Brennan waited for winter to arrive. He would not have to wait long. October arrived at Sweetwater Flats the way it always did on the high Wyoming plain. Not gradually, but all at once, like a door slamming shut on the warmth that had existed before it. The first hard frost came on October 3rd. By the second week of the month, overnight temperatures were regularly dipping below 18 degrees Fahrenheit minus 8 degrees Celsius, and the section hands were already calculating how long their stacks would last. Silas Brennan, for his part, was still working. The structural shell was ready. What remained was a layer of work that most frontier builders either did not think about or did not bother with: the thermal details. The difference between a cabin that survived a Wyoming winter and one that merely endured it lay almost entirely in those details, and Silas knew it. His first priority was the floor. The tank's original base had been open ground inside the stone foundation ring, packed earth that had been sealed with a thin skim of lime mortar when the tank was first installed. Earth, like stone, holds thermal mass, but bare earth in direct contact with sub-freezing ground loses that heat rapidly downward, conducting cold upward into the living space from below. Silas addressed this by laying a double course of flat sandstone pieces, scavenged from a nearby outcropping, directly on the earthen floor in a tight mosaic pattern. Over the stone, he spread a thin bed of dry ash from the depot burn pile, roughly half an inch, 1.2 centimeters, deep, tamped smooth. The ash layer served as a thermal break, fine particulate material with low conductivity that slowed the transfer of cold from the stone below into the air above. Over the ash, he laid a platform of split pine board salvaged from broken packing crates, elevated approximately 2 inches, 5 centimeters, above the stone on short wooden runners. The result was a floor system with 3 distinct thermal layers: stone mass at the base to absorb and hold radiant heat from the stove, ash insulation in the middle to slow downward heat loss, and a wooden surface above that was comfortable underfoot and did not conduct cold directly to bare skin. The total material cost of this floor system was effectively zero. Every component had been scavenged or salvaged from materials the depot was discarding. The stove itself required adjustment. The second-hand cast-iron box stove Silas had acquired was a standard frontier unit, a rectangular firebox approximately 18 inches, 45 centimeters, long by 12 inches, 30 centimeters, wide by 10 inches, 25 centimeters, tall, with a flat top surface that could double as a cooking surface and a small ash drawer at the base. In a rectangular cabin, such a stove was typically pushed against a wall or into a corner to save floor space. Silas had already decided to place it centrally, but he went one step further. He ringed the base of the stove with a low collar of stacked flat stones, sandstone pieces roughly 4 to 6 inches, 10 to 15 centimeters, thick, arranged in a horseshoe pattern open toward the door side. This stone collar served two purposes. First, it acted as a fire barrier, protecting the wooden floor platform from radiant heat at ground level. Second, and more importantly, the stones themselves absorbed radiant heat from the stove body during the burning hours and continued to emit that heat by radiation long after the fire had died down, extending the effective heating period of a single fire load by an estimated 2 to 4 hours. This principle, loading thermal mass adjacent to a heat source so that the mass absorbs energy and releases it slowly, was not new. It appeared in various forms across frontier and indigenous building traditions throughout North America. The Pueblo peoples of the Southwest had built thermal mass walls for centuries. Russian and Scandinavian immigrants in the upper Midwest had brought with them the tradition of the masonry heater, a large stone or brick stove body designed to absorb enormous quantities of heat from a short, intense fire and release it gradually over 6 to 12 hours. Silas had likely encountered none of these traditions directly, but he had grown up watching men manage heat under conditions of scarcity, and he had arrived at the same functional logic independently. The goal was not to make heat fast. The goal was to make heat last. The wall liner he had installed in September, the layered burlap, ash, and felt press against the inner iron shell, had dried and settled into a reasonably firm surface. He added a final outer layer, a ring of split pine slabs, rough cut, nailed to a simple framework of horizontal wooden battens he had driven into the mortar joints of the stone foundation ring. This created an air gap of approximately 1.5 inches, 3.8 centimeters, between the pine facing and the insulation layer behind it. Air gaps, even small ones, are effective insulation. Still air has very low thermal conductivity, and the trapped air in that gap added meaningfully to the wall assembly's overall resistance to heat loss. By the third week of October, the interior of the tank had been transformed. The curved walls no longer showed bare iron. The floor was layered dry and slightly elevated. The stove sat at center, ringed in stone. The south-facing door was double-sealed. A small sleeping platform ran along the northeast curve of the wall, built from salvaged lumber and positioned at a height of approximately 18 inches, 45 centimeters, above the floor, just above the cold air layer that naturally settled near ground level in any unheated space. Silas moved in on October 22, 1886. The section hands watched him carry his bedroll through the small iron door and close it behind him. Two of them exchanged a look. One of them, a track layer from Missouri named Pete Aldred, said something that the others remembered clearly enough to repeat later. "That man is going to be found frozen solid come January, and we'll have to chip him out with a pick." The others laughed. It seemed at the time like a reasonable prediction. Before we get to what actually happened that winter, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment below. Have you ever lived off-grid or tried to heat a space with unconventional methods? Tell us about it. The next part of this story is where the numbers get interesting. Word of what Silas Brennan had done traveled the depot corridor the way all news traveled on the frontier, unevenly, selectively, and with embellishment. By early November, the story had reached the other depot settlements along the line, and the reaction, almost uniformly, was skepticism at best and outright ridicule at worst. The objections came from men who knew construction, men who knew winters, and men who believed, with the confidence of hard experience, that they understood exactly how cold and iron interacted. Their first argument was the most intuitive. Iron is cold. Every man along the rail corridor had grabbed a steel tool handle on a January morning and felt the metal pull heat from his bare hand in seconds. Iron does not insulate. It conducts. The idea that a man could live comfortably inside a steel shell in a Wyoming winter without burning enormous quantities of which struck experienced builders as not just unusual, but physically backward. Owen Garrett, a carpenter from Nebraska who had built more than a dozen cabins along the Sweetwater corridor over the previous 8 years, put the objection most directly when he encountered Silas at the depot supply window in early November. "You've built yourself a tin icebox, friend. Iron will pull every BTU out of that stove before it reaches the air you're breathing." It was not an unreasonable point. Iron does conduct heat readily. Its thermal conductivity is roughly 26 to 30 BTU per hour per square foot per degree Fahrenheit per inch of thickness, compared to approximately 0.8 to 1.0 for pine logs. Without the insulating liner, Owen Garrett's prediction would have been largely correct. The iron shell would have acted as a radiator, transmitting interior warmth directly to the frozen exterior air. What Owen had not accounted for, what none of the critics had examined closely, was the liner, the combined ash, burlap, felt, pine slab, and air gap assembly that Silas had installed against the inner face of the tank did not make the iron disappear thermally, but it reduced the effective conductivity of the wall assembly dramatically. The iron was no longer in direct contact with the living air. There was a barrier, imperfect, improvised, but real, and that barrier changed the equation. The second objection was structural. Silas had made no modifications to the exterior of the tank. It remained a thin-walled iron cylinder sitting in open air, fully exposed to Wyoming wind on all sides except the base. A standard log cabin of the era, critics pointed out, had walls of 6 to 10 inches, 15 to 25 centimeters, of solid wood, a material that, for all its thermal limitations, still had meaningful insulating mass. The tank walls, even with the liner, were far thinner in total assembly than a well-built log wall. How? The critics asked, could a thinner wall possibly outperform a thicker one? The answer, which Silas offered to anyone who asked, and which most dismissed, lay not in wall thickness alone, but in surface area. Owen Garrett's best cabin on the corridor was a 16 by 20 foot, 4.9 by 6.1 m, rectangular structure with 288 square feet, 26.8 square meters, of wall area on the long faces alone, plus additional area on the gable ends and roof. Silas's cylindrical tank, 12 feet, 3.6 meters in diameter, had a total exterior wall surface area of approximately 528 square feet, 49 square meters, but enclosed a floor area of roughly 113 square feet, 10.5 square meters. Owen's cabin, with its rectangular geometry, enclosed 320 square feet, 29.7 square meters, of floor area behind those same wall surfaces. The cylinder was a smaller, more compact living space, but its curved geometry meant that for every square foot of living floor, the ratio of heat-losing exterior wall surface was lower than an equivalent rectangular structure. In plain terms, the tank didn't have to be as well insulated per square foot of wall because it had fewer square feet of wall per square foot of floor. The third objection was fire. A small cast iron stove, critics argued, could not safely heat a steel enclosure. The risk of overheating the metal, of fire spreading to the wooden liner, of the enclosed space becoming dangerous was, in their view, real. This concern was not entirely without merit. Silas had addressed it through the central placement of the stove, keeping away from all wall surfaces, and through the stone collar at its base, which prevented direct radiant contact between the firebox and the wooden floor. But the critics had never seen the interior, and their imaginations filled the gap with scenarios of smoke and trapped heat and iron walls glowing in the dark. Gideon Martz, the depot superintendent, heard the objections and said nothing publicly. He had authorized the conversion and had no desire to revisit the decision. But a depot ledger entry from November 12, 1886, preserved in the station records, notes, in Gideon's handwriting, that he had personally inspected Brennan's iron quarters and found them of unconventional but apparently sound construction, no immediate hazard observed. It was not an endorsement, but it was something. The section hands kept watching. Pete Aldred, who had made the pick and ice prediction the previous month, made a point of walking past the tank every morning on his way to the rail line. He noted with some confusion that the smoke from Silas's flue pipe was thin and steady in the early morning hours, not the thick, urgent smoke of a man burning desperately through it to stay alive, but the slow, regulated exhaust of a fire burning at low intensity, well-fed but unhurried. He mentioned this to Owen Garrett. Owen told him it was probably just a smaller fire, meaning the man inside was probably just colder. November passed. December arrived. The temperature began to fall in earnest. And then came January. the blizzard that reached Sweetwater Flats on January 9th. 1887 was not the worst storm in Wyoming's recorded history, but it was close enough to matter. It arrived from the northwest in the late afternoon, announced by a drop in barometric pressure that the depot's small weather instrument registered at roughly 0.4 inches of mercury in less than 6 hours, a fall that experienced plainsmen recognized as a signature of a major system. By nightfall on January 9th, the temperature had dropped to minus 14 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 26 degrees Celsius, with sustained winds of 35 to 40 miles per hour, 56 to 64 kilometers per hour. By the morning of January 10th, wind chill values across the open corridor were estimated by local oral accounts at between minus 55 degrees Fahrenheit and minus 65 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 48 degrees Celsius to minus 54 degrees Celsius. The snow came in horizontal sheets that reduced visibility to near zero and packed into every gap and joined in every structure along the line. The storm held for 2 full days and a third night before breaking. In Owen Garrett's best-built cabin, the 16 by 20 foot, 4.9 by 6.1 m structure he had completed in 1884 and considered his finest work on the corridor. His family burned through a full quarter cord of split pine in the first 18 hours of the storm, running the stove at near maximum output to maintain an interior temperature that, by Owen's own later account, never climbed above 48 degrees Fahrenheit, 9 degrees Celsius during the overnight hours of January 9th. The wind was finding every seam. The corners of the cabin, those geometrically cold zones where 2 exterior walls met at right angles, ran with condensation and frost on the interior faces. Owen's youngest daughter slept in her coat and 2 blankets and still woke with cold feet. The bunkhouse fared worse. The long rectangular structure, with its higher surface-to-volume ratio and its multiple occupants adding to humidity load, developed ice on the interior wall surfaces within 24 hours of the storm's start. The stove ran continuously. By the end of the second day, the bunkhouse with supply was effectively exhausted, and the men were burning dismantled furniture to stay warm. Then there was the tank. Orville Cass, the supply rider who had first pressed his palm against a warm iron shell the previous January and started the story, happened to be sheltering at the depot during the storm, unable to ride out. On the morning of January 10th, at what he estimated to be the storm's worst hours, he walked across the yard to the tank. He pressed his hand against the outer iron shell again, as he had the year before. The iron was cold to the touch, as expected, given the exterior temperature of minus 14 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 26 degrees Celsius, and the wind driving against it. The liner was doing its job. The iron was no longer acting as a direct radiator of interior warmth. What Orville noticed instead was the flue pipe, still producing that thin, steady column of smoke, the same low, regulated burn he had observed in calmer weather. The fire inside was not at maximum output. It was running, by the evidence of the smoke, at something close to a maintenance burn. He knocked on the iron door. Silas Brennan opened it. The interior temperature of the tank, by Silas's own reckoning, using a small household thermometer he had purchased at the Laramie General Store the previous spring, was 61 degrees Fahrenheit, 16 degrees Celsius. At the height of the storm, with fire that Silas described as about a third loaded, easy burn, nothing urgent. Owen Garrett's cabin, during those same hours, was holding 48 degrees Fahrenheit, 9 degrees Celsius at full burn. The bunkhouse, at near continuous maximum output, had dropped to approximately 42 degrees Fahrenheit, 5.5 degrees Celsius before the furniture started going in. The differential was not a rounding error. It was a 13 degrees Fahrenheit to 19 degrees Fahrenheit, 7 degrees Celsius to 11 degrees Celsius, gap between the cylindrical iron tank and the best rectangular timber structures on the corridor, under identical outdoor conditions, during the same storm, over the same period of time. Silas's consumption over the 2-day storm period was approximately half a cord. Owen Garrett's cabin consumed a full cord during the same period, and that was with the family enduring temperatures 13 degrees colder than Silas's interior. The bunkhouse, to maintain its lower interior temperature, had burned through its entire remaining wood stock and begun dismantling furniture. Local accounts from the depot station records, corroborated by a letter Owen Garrett wrote to a cousin in Nebraska in February of 1887, describe what happened in the days after the storm broke. Garrett walked across the yard to the tank. He asked Silas if he could come inside. Silas let him in. Garrett stood in the center of the circular space for a long moment, looking at the stone collar around the stove, the layered floor, the curved walls, the steady low fire, and said nothing for some time. Then he asked Silas to explain it to him from the beginning. Silas did. Owen Garrett built a cylindrical root cellar the following spring. It was not a perfect replica of Silas's tank. He used stone and sod rather than iron, working with what was available, but the geometry was deliberate and the thermal logic was the same. By the following winter of 1887 to 88, 3 other families on the eastern corridor had incorporated circular or semicircular thermal mass elements into their existing cabin designs. Stone apses attached to the cold north wall, circular sleeping alcoves with packed earth mass walls, corner stove arrangements ringed in sandstone that mimicked the heat storage collar Silas had built around his firebox. None of these were exact copies of what Silas had done. Frontier adaptation rarely worked by direct replication. It worked by selective adoption, by taking the principle that had proven itself and applying it to materials and conditions at hand. What spread along the Sweetwater corridor in 1887 and 1888 was not a blueprint. It was an idea that the shape of a space and the thermal mass within it mattered as much as the fuel burned inside it. Pete Aldred, the track layer who had predicted Silas would be chipped out of the tank with a pick, was among the first to ask for advice. He came to Silas in March of 1887 with a plan to rebuild the interior of his cabin before the following winter. Silas spent an afternoon walking through the space with him, pointing out the corners where cold pooled, the north wall that bled heat directly into the wind, the flat-faced fireplace that sent the majority of its radiant output up the chimney rather than into the room. By the following November, Aldred had moved his stove to a more central position, wrapped its base in a ring of flat river stones, and packed the north wall cavity with a mixture of dry grass and wood ash. His family, by his own account, burned less wood that winter than in any previous season, and was warmer for it. The water tank itself remained standing at the Sweetwater Flats Depot for several more years, serving as a dwelling through at least 2 more winters after the blizzard January 1887. Silas Brennan transferred to a different section post in 1889. What became of him after that is not recorded in any surviving railroad document. The tank itself was eventually dismantled for scrap iron, the fate of most railroad infrastructure outliving its original purpose. But the station ledger entries, Owen Garrett's letter, and a brief mention in a Union Pacific maintenance report from 1888 noting Brennan's insulated iron quarters, inspected serviceable, recommended as winter quarters for maintenance personnel, leave a clear enough trace. What Silas understood, and what his neighbors came to understand after the storm of January 1887, was not a secret. It was geometry, thermal mass, and a refusal to accept the first solution as the only solution. Modern building science confirms the principles he worked from. Cylindrical and dome structures do have lower surface-to-volume ratios than rectangular structures of equivalent floor area. Thermal mass adjacent to a heat source does extend the effective heating period of a given fuel load. Central stove placement in a circular space does produce more even heat distribution than corner or wall placement in a rectangular one. The insulating value of an air gap, even a small one, is recognized in every contemporary building code that addresses wall assembly performance. None of these ideas originated with Silas Brennan. He encountered them secondhand, through observation and necessity, and assembled them in a single structure at a specific moment of need. That is how most engineering actually advances on the frontier, not through laboratories or formal study, but through men and women who face a problem that could not wait for an expert, and who solved what they had and what they understood. The iron shell at Sweetwater Flats was not elegant. It was not comfortable by any standard above bare survival. But on the night of January 10th, 1887, when the wind was running at 40 miles per hour and the temperature outside was minus 14 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 26 degrees Celsius, and the best timber cabin on the corridor was struggling to hold 48 degrees Fahrenheit, 9 degrees Celsius at full burn. Inside that tank, at a third of a fire, it was 61 degrees Fahrenheit, 16 degrees Celsius. That difference, 13 degrees half the wood, a shape that everyone called wrong, is the kind of difference that keeps people alive. It is also the kind of difference that gets forgotten. The frontier is full of solutions that worked once, proved themselves under the worst possible conditions, and then disappeared when the pressure lifted, and people went back to doing things the way they had always been done. The cylindrical iron shell at Sweetwater Flats was one of them. The Russian masonry heater, the sod-walled dugout, the smoke-channeling techniques of the Scots-Irish long hunter, the earth-burned root cellar, the corner stove placement of Scandinavian immigrant settlements. These are not curiosities. They are a body of applied thermal knowledge developed under conditions of genuine scarcity, tested by winters that did not forgive mistakes, and validated by the only standard that has ever truly mattered out there, survival. They were not primitive. They were precise. And most of them are still waiting to be rediscovered. If this story made you think differently about heat, shelter, or the intelligence of people who built what they had, hit the like button and make sure you're subscribed. Every week we go back into the historical record and pull out the engineering that got buried. Drop a comment below. What forgotten frontier technique do you want us to cover next? The archive runs deep and we're nowhere near done. Educational and historical note. This script is a dramatized historical reconstruction for educational and storytelling purposes. The characters, dialogue, and specific measurements are plausible reconstructions based on documented frontier building conditions and materials of the era. This content does not substitute for professional engineering, construction, or fire safety guidance. Always consult qualified professionals before undertaking any building or heating project.